Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 213th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. Today, our panel will engage in part 2 of our discussion on diversity and what is its real meaning within the context of social engineering. Today's discussion begins with Tom Finley, retired Vice President of Human Resources Development at Rubbermaid Incorporated. Then Patty Haskins, former member of the Wadsworth City Council and the faculty of Wadsworth High School. Then Bryan Laubaugh, President of R&B Financial Services, and Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired Senior Research Chemist. Tom, in the 60s, diversifying opportunities to take part in the American dream applied mainly to race and gender. Since then, it has come to be applied to many other minority groups. We have come to think of diversity as making sure the head count in various forums matches the population head counts. Is this all there is to diversification?
Well, John, the first question to be answered, I think, is what is diversity today? And when people use it, are we using it the same way twice? How do we know what's right and achievable when we have such a broad statement or a word like diversity? It occurs to me it's like saying we're going to win the football game 26-7 and not having defined any of the players or the plays or anything else. We've established this number of 17%, and how are we going to measure that? It seems like it's dooming it to failure in terms of measurement before we start by not addressing some of those things I just brought up. It's very hard to predict without being specific about what it is you want to change. And using the word diversity doesn't do that for me, nor I think anybody else. So it means we have to dig down and look at the changes and define the change and say, how then would we know it did change, which of course is where the measurement comes. So John, I think in many ways we've got the cart before the horse here. We haven't dug down and looked at the specifics well enough to know when we have made change that's meaningful and lasting.
Now, Patty, what are your thoughts?
Well, to me, diversity means equal representation, or I should say fair representation, because it may not be equal to be fair, and fair opportunities, no matter what the situation might be, whether it be for admittance into a college, that you have the same opportunity as someone else of a different race or a different gender. That you have the same that you have this fair representation, so that if, for example, in a political nature, if you are discussing a particular issue or bill that is to be passed by the Congress or by the Senate, that you have all stakeholders represented that should be represented. So you have different points of view, opposing and pro points of view for however you particularly feel, because only then can you find a solution to a problem that I think benefits all. I know in politics, a lot of people say, well, there isn't diversity because you have all of the different caucuses. For example, you might have the Black Caucus, where you have to be a black person to belong to that caucus, or the Freedom Caucus, where you have to be a certain, how would I describe the Freedom Caucus? As
conservative.
Don't look at me.
A certain bent or feeling on the conservative side to belong. AOC is not going to be able to join the Freedom Caucus, let's put it that way.
Oh, that's not fair.
No, I know, it's not fair. But the problem is I don't have a problem with that, because in those cases you're having a group that is like-minded, that are discussing issues that pertain to them, and only they know what pertains to them. But the caucuses don't pass legislation, they don't make legislation. What they then do is they come to because there may be diversity within the caucus itself, because whether you happen to be from an urban area or a rural area, whether you are more concerned with manufacturing or maybe you're more concerned with farming, you have different views even though you have that same overall name. But those caucuses decide on what is best for them, and then they take it to the committees where hopefully there is diversity, and they can present, because they're the best people to present their concerns and so forth. And they come hopefully to solutions for various problems that they have.
But when you're talking about diversity, you're still only talking about head count. Certain percentage of
But
blacks.
not necessarily head count as much as representation. I think that, we've gotten to the point where it's head count, particularly in cases where, for example, colleges have to accept a certain percentage of black applicants, a certain percent of Asian applicants, a certain percent of people that are indigenous peoples that are represented. And they usually do that count by the percentage of the population that is represented by that particular group.
Yeah.
I do have some problems with that, but I think that you can find quality in all groups, and to say that there shouldn't be a representation of those, because otherwise what you would see, as was 50, 60 years ago, where, for example, colleges were dominated by white males and other groups were not represented and were not allowed to be represented. So
that's back when female students were referred to as co-eds.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I'm going to circle back to some of that, but I want to hear what Bryan has to say.
Well, it's good to be back in the studio. It's good to be back with good friends. There's a whole different feel when you come here as a group and you're able to discuss issues like this. I don't know if we really achieve that through Zoom. It's a okay substitute as far as I'm concerned. I look forward to coming. I think one of the issues that I have with diversity is it has a tendency to lower the bar when it comes to the performance of an organization. When you have to promote people within an organization to maintain your diversity status, I think that creates issues as far as having an organization organically grow the best possible people. Because other people see that and they say, well, I'm not part of that group that's going to get hired or promoted within, and so they leave an organization. I'm all for diversity, and I've said it time and time again. I want the best possible person in the position, whether they're white, black, brown, Asian, male, female, trans. If it is the best possible person, I want it merit-based. I have a problem with preference-based hiring, and that's what this has sort of grown out of. Diversity hiring has grown out of preference-based hiring. And I get that there are certain organizations that needed this to hire the right types of people, but when you take it to its end, it really doesn't. You might have a diverse work group, but do you really have diverse thought? Do you really have diversity of outcomes and all that kind of stuff that goes into an organization? Because they're all living. You can say, Walmart's a corporation and they're this corporate thing, but that's to me, is a living organization. And they do their best to hire a diverse work force. How does a smaller business, say 100 employees or less, in Northeast Ohio, really get diversity than, say, a company that's in New York? So it's fraught with issues that I think really need to be looked at before we force that on companies. I mentioned earlier in our part one about ESG. That's environmental, social, and governmental. And this is being pushed by investment managers, one being BlackRock, they're pushing this, and it's one way to make corporations what they feel is more accountable, but they have to have a statement, they have to have a plan in place to, what are they going to do to be carbon neutral 25 years down the road. And you lay all these things on corporations, and then you throw diversity on there, and you say, how do they survive? How do those companies really stick to their core businesses without worrying about all these other things? And I'm not saying I don't want to diminish diversity. I know it's important, but we have to have guardrails when it comes to it.
Yeah. At some point during the week, I had an opportunity to look at the makeup of the Akron Board of Education. And I noticed there is one individual, a well-qualified person by education and all, but his responsibility on the board was to be responsible for diversity, inclusion, and equity. Ron introduced me to the word inclusion during our last meeting, and I'm wondering, Ron, what does that mean to you? What is inclusion?
Fun fact first, in terms of gender diversity, the New York Philharmonic, traditionally an all-male orchestra, has just for the first time now has a majority of women in their orchestra. Interesting thing. Yeah.
I bet you they all play flutes, don't they? Well, no.
Interesting. Thinking about inclusion and the best person for the job reminded me in some ways about our late friend Joe Gaines. He wanted us at one time to look into the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we did not take up on that challenge. But I came across an item in a paper just the other day, and I followed up on that a little bit. There's a group called Accenture. They're a management consultant firm out of Cleveland. You may know them, but they're looking at handicapped in the workplace. They said no, it's an ideal to always have a nice young able-bodied person, but 23% they say of all job seekers and people in the workforce are handicapped or disabled in some way. That's a more politically correct term these days. But and they have done a study on this, and they found up to, let's see how I put this here. If you include the handicapped, and by not just meaning just hire them for diversity's sake, but make it possible in the workplace to use their abilities, whatever they may be, and include them into the social network of the company culture, but also in making available for them whatever they need to do their job. That if I can read this now, these companies that have done that have a 28% higher revenue, double the net income, and 30% higher economic profit. So a distinct business advantage to putting an inclusive atmosphere into the workplace for folks with disabilities. And I think by
But excuse me, were they adding to the profitability of the company because they're disabled, or because they have other skills that you'd want anyway?
They have the skill that you want anyway, but make it possible to say, oh, well, no, they're disabled, and I'll have to level the threshold in that bathroom to be able to get the wheelchair in there. Or to make it, or to, for example, they use an autistic person is easily distracted. Maybe that person should be allowed to wear noise-canceling headphones in their job if it doesn't otherwise impact their performance or their safety in the workplace. You might not want that in an automobile factory, but okay in an office. And so things of that sort, to take advantage of the individuals and make it possible for them to be included in the workplace in a meaningful way. And it's maybe a little different than just saying, okay, this person has brown skin and all this white sea of white here around him or her, and just, okay, what possible capability does that infer on them that the white person does not have? No, as Bryan says, the best possible person for the job, but make it possible to do that without regard to their particular ethnicity or their particular gender. or preference in gender. And so particularly in the case of disabled, it seems to be a very clear thing to allow that the company culture to be recognized that those folks have different needs, but in order to fulfill and to practice their abilities to the community, to the benefit of the company, and these statistics seem to point that out.
Yeah, so inclusion in this case means we're bringing people on board because of what they have to offer.
Yes, exactly.
And I think also to prevent bias.
And to prevent
bias from excluding those particular individuals.
Ableism is a real thing. People say, "Oh, you're disabled."
What
so
about
you can't do this.
Supposedly there's a big benefit to having people from different cultural backgrounds, to put them into the mix to help better decision making on the part of the university or corporation and all. Does that I mean, we go ahead and get our head counts percentages in place, but does that really contribute anything to the corporation other than making other employees very, very careful about how they talk to one of the minority people for fear of getting sued?
You know, it could depend upon, like if you're in an educational situation, having people of different cultures involved in a discussion, let's say in a history class, could be quite beneficial, rather than having all Caucasian males in that class. If you have people from all different ethnicities within that class, you're going to have a better classroom discussion, wouldn't you think?
Oh, well, that's my question to you. You've spent a lifetime in the classroom. Does it really help? Well,
yeah, I think so. Right. It might depend upon the class that you're in. You know, in a math class, I always kind of thought that math was kind of non-biased.
Factual.
I think that when diversity is seen as a positive, we're well on our way to growing in whatever endeavor it is. That is a critical achievement, that in whatever part of society we are involved, that diversity is seen as a positive move in around.
And don't you think we have to be very, very careful to avoid bringing people into an organization just because they're not like the rest of the majority of the people that are there? I mean, I was thinking years ago we came up with LGBT, right?
Cute.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. It is now LGBTQIAP. Guess what the P stands for? Plus. That's the plus is that everybody else that can't clearly define what they're, you know,
people like that.
Somebody doesn't feel like they have the same sexual feelings that the guy next door has, but he's not sure what they are, so he's a plus. You know, I think that one of the problems that we have, and Patty pointed it out, when you have a group of blacks or lesbians or whatever, and they form a caucus or a club, and now they're looking out only for their own self-interest to make sure that the lesbians or the pluses get their seat at the table. What does that do to the decision-making of the organization other than distort it?
I don't know that distorts it. That organization is formed, is formed to advance a cause or the interest of that group, but those organizations very, very seldom actually make the decisions. It's so that they can speak with one voice when going before organizations or groups that can solve their problems or act upon concerns that they have. They do not want to be, you don't want to approach Congress or the Senate or whatever with 12 different voices saying what is good for the LGBTQ group or for the black community, or for the indigenous peoples community. You want to go through with one voice that makes a stronger voice, which then can be heard, and hopefully their concerns will be taken under their wing.
I think that's a very good point too, in terms, particularly thinking about the indigenous community. Until the indigenous Americans began to band together, no one minded if you put a pipeline through their reservation and contaminated their water supply. But banding together in groups, starting quite some time ago now, were able to get something done in order to protect their interests and bring their problems to the wider community, so that they get some support for that and try to right some wrongs that have existed historically. And I think that's an important thing. And John, you're talking about what does it bring to the table? And it's similar to the math in a chemistry laboratory. It doesn't particularly matter what gender, what their ethnicity and so forth that they have, as long as you're doing your scientific work. The last job I had, there was a fellow from India who was the director of research, and my particular supervisor was a Muslim from Bangladesh. So it didn't matter. It didn't really matter. Yeah. Now there are cultural differences. The smell of curry emanating from an office was overwhelming sometimes, but that's an entirely separate thing.
You got used to it though, right? Because it was your boss.
I don't know if I ever would.
Well, I still think that the business of seeing diversity as a positive is what needs to be promoted.
Right.
And that is extremely difficult, of course, because the other side of that is the prejudice that enters into any of the differences that occur in people or circumstances. So, again, how do we make that happen is a subject for another day, but it seems like that is the challenge.
There is a challenge there. I remember in grad school, an Indian student refused to wash any of his glassware because where he grew up as an undergraduate, they had people that did that for them. Yeah. It took him a long time, and it took us a long time to kind of get over that and stop blaming him for this, and to try to encourage him to do his part in the laboratory.
Did he ever get around to it?
He did.
And John,
that's a good example.
I have to agree with John and Bryan in as much as setting arbitrary percentages to establish diversity is difficult, and I'm not sure
it's not the answer.
That's not the answer to that, and it does create problems that you see, whether it be in the workplace or whatever. But I still don't think that means that you throw diversity out or say that it's not a cause that we need to fight for and continue to have, because just like this panel would not be nearly as good if the only voices that were on here were from the right side, or if all the voices were from the left side. We've always tried to keep it equal, and I know, John, there's been occasions where we didn't have Bryan, for example, where we really needed to hear that strong conservative opinion just to counter and to consider what we're saying.
So you missed me?
No, not at all.
Well, you missed the point there.
I would throw this out. Disney has run amok with diversity, and their profits have shown it. They've just replaced their CEO with the old CEO. He's going to bring back some order. Yeah. And the saying, go woke, go broke. When we take diversity to the extreme, which is wokeness, you lose. And Disney is lost. And they're in the process of trying to bring back the Disney that produced all these great hits, the Disney that we knew, the Disney that you go, the Disney World, all that kind of stuff. This is all boiled over because of what Disney did by taking diversity almost to the extreme of having subgroups of people. You had a variety of groups, all fractured, trying to produce a movie for kids. And if there weren't enough gay individuals, gay cartoons. There weren't enough lesbian cartoon people. There weren't enough trans people in it. You know, you really start to mess with your product. So I just put that out there, that there is an extreme, and Disney is struggling with that extreme right now, and they have to bring it back. Everyone's for diversity, but when you go so far down that road with diversity, you start.
Yeah, once you start, it's hard to put the brakes on, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard
but
to
you know,
put.
in some ways, some of it was good, I think, because if all little girls see as their model princess the blonde, blue-eyed white girl, that little girls of different ethnicities need to see, they want the princess that looks like them.
Yeah.
And changes like that, which have been challenged, but changes like that are good. So I guess it's maybe to the degree to which you take.
Right. Exactly.
I wonder if Mattel lost any when they introduced a black Barbie.
Not up on Barbies.
Well,
G.I. Joe's
I
maybe,
want to close with this one comment. I think that nothing spells out the difficulty of the situation any more than the Bakke decision in the Supreme Court. Here is a man who was denied admission to medical school when his grades were much higher than people who were admitted that were minorities. So they sacrificed quality in order to. And the Supreme Court, when they made their decision, decided, well, Bakke could go, but this doesn't set the standard. This is not a precedent-setting decision. Well, thank you very much, folks. And wouldn't it be nice to be back here again next week?
in 2 weeks.
No, okay. Hey, I got to.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.